Wassily Kandinsky, Part 1. They said his paintings made no sense, until they realized they were looking at music. In the winter of 1896, a man stepped off a train in Munich carrying a single suitcase. Inside it, not clothes, not money, but dozens of small, strange sketches, swirls of color, jagged lines and shapes that seemed alive. The man's name was Wassily Kandinsky, and within a few decades he would be called the father of abstract art. But his journey was not one of easy genius. It was a long, relentless obsession, born out of a single moment, a moment that changed his life forever. A moment when he heard color. Childhood in Moscow, the first sparks. Wassily Kandinsky was born in Moscow in 1866 to a family that straddled two worlds. His father, a wealthy tea merchant with aristocratic tastes, and his mother, a woman of refined sensibilities who adored music. Their home was filled with the sounds of the piano and the scent of lacquered wood from the father's shop. But young Wassily was not like the other children of his social class. While others played games in the snow, he would sit for hours staring at the patterns of frost on the window, tracing invisible lines through the ice. One evening when he was about 5 years old, his aunt placed a small box of watercolors in front of him. As he pressed the brush to the paper, he felt something extraordinary, a sensation as though each color had a sound, each hue vibrating in the air around him. He did not have the words for it then, but later he would describe this as synesthesia, a rare neurological crossing of senses where one can hear colors and see sounds. That strange gift would haunt and guide him for the rest of his life. A future abandoned. Yet art was not his first path. Kandinsky's parents, pragmatic and ambitious, believed a career in law would secure his future. And Wassily obeyed for a time. He studied law and economics at the University of Moscow, becoming a promising young scholar. But in 1895, while visiting an exhibition in Moscow, he encountered a painting by Claude Monet, Haystacks at Giverny. It was not a portrait, nor a grand historical scene. It was just a shimmering field of color. Yet when Kandinsky looked at it, he felt as though someone had opened a secret door in his mind. He could hear the yellows, taste the blues. It was a silent symphony that only he seemed to notice. That night, Kandinsky could not sleep. By morning he knew, law was over. His destiny lay in the world of paint, not paper. Munich, the struggle begins. At 30 years old, an age when most artists were already well established, Kandinsky arrived in Munich to start from scratch. He was a foreigner, poor and older than his classmates. The other students mocked his strange theories about color and sound. But Kandinsky worked with an intensity that frightened even his teachers. He rented a cold, dim apartment where the only warmth came from the oil lamps he used late into the night. In that tiny studio, walls stained with turpentine, he began to break the rules, painting shapes without clear subjects, experimenting with violent contrasts of color, trying to make the viewer hear what he saw. Some days, he would stand in front of the canvas for hours without moving, as if waiting for the colors to speak first. Love and loss. In Munich, he met Gabriele Munter, a young German artist who would become his partner in both art and life. Together, they traveled through Europe, sketching villages, experimenting with bold palettes, and dreaming of a new kind of painting, one that freed art from the prison of realism. But while their love for each other was strong, the world outside was changing. Political tensions in Europe began to rise. War was no longer a distant whisper, it was on the horizon. And for Kandinsky, the next decade would bring not only artistic breakthroughs, but exile, heartbreak, and a fight to defend his very right to create. Part 2. The birth of the Blue Rider. In 1911, Kandinsky gathered a group of restless artists in Munich, among them Franz Marc, August Mack, and Alexej von Jawlensky. They were young, passionate, and united by one conviction: art should not merely imitate the visible world, it should reveal the invisible. They called themselves Der Blaue Reiter, the Blue Rider. The name came from Kandinsky's love of the color blue, which he associated with spirituality, and Marc's fascination with horses. To them, the rider symbolized the artist's quest to move beyond the material world. In their manifesto, Kandinsky wrote words that shocked the conservative art world. Color is a power which directly influences the soul. No landscapes. No polite portraits. Just explosions of pigment and form, attempting to paint the music of the soul. Their exhibitions scandalized the critics. One review sneered, "This is not art, this is madness." Kandinsky smiled when he read it. Madness was exactly what he wanted to free from its chains. The sound of war. But just as the Blue Rider began to gallop into history, the world collapsed. In 1914, the gunshots of the First World War echoed across Europe. For Kandinsky, it was more than a political crisis. it was a personal disaster. As a Russian in Germany, he was suddenly an enemy alien. The police arrived at his Munich apartment, giving him only days to leave. He packed what little he could, but most of his paintings, his sketches, his precious experiments in color, were left behind. Many were lost forever. Returning to Moscow, Kandinsky found a city he no longer recognized. Revolution was brewing. The streets were filled with red flags, the sound of marching boots, and speeches shouted from the steps of government buildings. He tried to continue painting, but the hunger and chaos of war seeped into his work. His colors grew darker. The once bright symphonies of blue and gold now carried the deep, heavy tones of blood red and black. A brief role in the revolution. For a short time, Kandinsky took a role in the new Soviet art administration. He dreamed of bringing art to the people, to factories, to schools, to the streets. But the revolution had no patience for abstract visions. The new government wanted art that glorified the workers, the army, the future of the state. Kandinsky's mystical swirls and dreamlike forms were dismissed as bourgeois indulgence. He realized his own revolution was not the same as theirs. By 1921, feeling trapped, he left Russia once again, this time for Germany. But his return would be very different from his first arrival. The Bauhaus years. In 1922, Kandinsky joined the Bauhaus, the legendary German school of art and design. Here, surrounded by architects, typographers, and designers, his work evolved again. He began to experiment with geometry, sharp angles, perfect circles, precise lines, but still infused with his belief in the spiritual power of color. His studio at the Bauhaus was a strange hybrid of laboratory and temple. Against white walls, bright canvases leaned in silent conversation. Jars of paint were arranged like chemical specimens. Students would arrive to find Kandinsky silently studying a single dot of yellow for half an hour before speaking. Every line is attention. Every shape has a soul, he told them. The Bauhaus years were some of his most productive, but also some of his most fragile. Outside the school, Germany was again falling into darkness. Part 3. The shadows of a new tyranny. By the early 1930s, the storm clouds over Germany were unmistakable. The Nazis, rising with terrifying speed, had a very clear definition of acceptable art. It had to be realistic, heroic, and serve the propaganda machine. Abstract art, Kandinsky's art, was labeled degenerate. The regime saw it as dangerous, un-German, even subversive. When the Nazis began shutting down progressive institutions, the Bauhaus was one of their first targets. In 1933, the school was dissolved. Kandinsky found himself once again in exile, his paintings removed from museums, some destroyed, others sold for a fraction of their worth. A canvas he had spent months working on was tossed into a corner like a broken piece of furniture. For the third time in his life, he packed his brushes and fled. This time, his destination was France. Paris, beauty in exile. In Paris, Kandinsky was a foreigner among artists. The city was full of surrealists and cubists, but his work didn't quite fit into either world. Still, he found a small apartment in Neuilly-sur-Seine, turning the living room into his studio. Light filtered through the tall windows, scattering across the floor like fragments of stained glass. Here, he began to paint works unlike any he had done before, forms that felt organic, almost microscopic, as though he were peering into the secret architecture of life itself. He called them his biomorphic paintings, amoebas, cells, and strange undersea creatures floating in seas of radiant blue and gold. It was as if he had turned his gaze from the cosmic to the molecular. But outside his window, Paris was drifting toward another war. The Second War, silence in the soul. When the German army marched into Paris in 1940, Kandinsky was 74 years old. His Russian passport offered little protection. Supplies became scarce. Canvas and paint were luxuries he could barely afford. And yet he painted. Every day he sat at his easel, layering colors in slow, meditative strokes. It was as if the outside world no longer existed, and his studio was a fragile island of light in an ocean of darkness. In each line there is music. In each color, a prayer, he wrote in a letter to a friend. By 1944 the war was turning, but his health was failing. Still he worked feverishly, knowing time was slipping away. His final works shimmered with luminous blues, gentle pinks, and soft yellows, like the colors of dawn after a long night. Part 4. The final canvas. In the summer of 1944, Kandinsky could feel his body weakening. He was 78, yet his eyes still held the sharpness of a young man searching for the truth in colors. His Paris apartment was cluttered with jars of pigments, stacks of unfinished sketches, and canvases leaning against the walls like silent witnesses. He began a work that would become his last, a composition filled with delicate biomorphic shapes, drifting in a sea of pale turquoise. The forms were lighter, freer, as if untethered from gravity. There was no sense of struggle in it, only peace. Neighbors sometimes saw him sitting quietly before it, brush in hand but unmoving, as if listening to something inaudible. Perhaps it was music only he could hear, a final, private symphony. The quiet departure. On December 13, 1944, Wassily Kandinsky died quietly in his apartment, with the smell of turpentine still in the air. The final painting, unfinished, stood on the easel. There was no grand farewell, no final public statement. The war still raged, and Paris barely noticed the passing of the man who had once declared that painting could be as pure and powerful as music. And yet, in the silence that followed, his colors began to travel. Friends, collectors, and fellow artists carried his works beyond the dark borders of war, spreading them to museums and private collections around the world. The legacy that breathes. Today, when you stand before a Kandinsky, you can almost hear it. A vibration, a hum, a rhythm that feels alive. His paintings do not just hang on walls, they pulse. They invite you into a place where shapes dance, lines sing, and colors breathe. Kandinsky believed that art could awaken the soul. And in a world still fractured by chaos, his canvases remain beacons, not of answers but of possibilities. In the end, Wassily Kandinsky painted not to record what he saw, but to reveal what could not be seen, the invisible music of the universe.